So this is my attempt to try to break down Deuteronomy 32, 42 to 43. It's much more in depth, and I just want to work through the verses. And I have other passages that I'd like to read where applicable. So there are other passages to consider, and this is the in-depth breakdown. If this starts to feel like it's too much, I made another video that's a little bit quicker, a little too long didn't read version, and it's on, I shared it with the group, How Church Works. But for now, let's dive in. So I'm going to try to translate Deuteronomy 32, 42 to 43. So we have Ashkir, and the Dead Sea Scrolls would say Ashkirah. It adds a hey. It doesn't really change the meaning. But this would be to be drunk. Be drunk, like out to be full or sated, to be kind of drunk on. To be drunk, my arrows, chatzai. So Yahweh, okay, midam, okay, from blood. Here, the speaker in this, towards the end of this song that Moses has Israel memorize, that Yahweh composes, the speaker is Yahweh. Yahweh says, my arrows will be drunk from blood. Not a pretty picture. The next portion of this verse, V'chorbi tochal basar midam halal. My sword, okay, and my sword will devour or eat. Okay, will devour or eat. Basar midam halal, the flesh or meat. His sword's going to eat flesh or meat. Midam, there it is again, midam, from blood of the pierced or the slain, pierced through and slain. That makes sense because he's the one who has the sword. So Yahweh's the one with the sword here, and he's doing battle. This is probably a good. This is a good aside. So I'll stick with just this portion right now and try to work through some other verses. So the sword of Yahweh will be drunk from, or the arrow of Yahweh will be drunk from blood. The sword, his sword, will eat the flesh from the blood of the slain. When does this happen? When will this happen? How is this to be interpreted? How do we understand this? First off, you can ask, when does this happen? Well, earlier in this song, in Deuteronomy 32, Yahweh has said that he will leave his people. He'll actually leave from their midst. The entire setup of Israel and Yahweh depends on him being there locally, him living in the tent and being there. And this is absolutely essential for them to inherit the land, for them to maintain their land from enemies. He is their protector, and he has to be there locally. He lives in the house. So the entire Torah depends on him being with them so they can fulfill various commands to come into his presence, to eat with him, to be near him, to draw near him, to seek him. He actually has to locally be in the land. But we know from earlier in the song he's going to leave. And so there is this idea of Yahweh's, he's going to leave because they defile the land with their worship of other gods. It would then make sense that Yahweh is going to have a direct confrontation with other gods. And he's going to confront them and their followers, and this will result in him changing the landscape, which is partly how we can jump to the end. That's where this is the idea of atonement being accomplished. It's at this point with this kind of background and view that I want to touch on maybe a couple passages. And they are Isaiah, I would say read Isaiah 63. It depicts Yahweh as a man of war, a soldier who comes in stomping out in wrath and with blood-splattered garments, but it also describes when Yahweh comes locally to accomplish these kinds of things. I would also read Exodus 15, 1, 2, and actually, you know, I think it'd be better if I read some of these. I think it would help. So if we go to Exodus 15, and we'll read 1 through 18. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Yahweh, and they said, "Let me sing to Yahweh, because he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he hurled into the sea. Yah is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name." So already we have this depiction of Yahweh as a warrior when he's there locally. This is the song that Israel sings to him right after he defeats Pharaoh and right after he defeats Pharaoh's army through battling them with their chariot wheels and closing the Red Sea on them. See, they're understanding that event as Yahweh going to war. And here's the thing, they don't just see Yahweh going to war with a bunch of humans. Pharaoh is this conduit to the unseen realm in their eyes. This is why in Numbers and in Exodus, Yahweh says, "I will bring judgment on the Egyptians and their gods." Their Elohim. He's not saying, "I will bring judgment on Santa Claus. I will bring judgment on their tooth fairies. I will bring judgment on their elf on a shelf." He says, "I will bring judgment on their gods." These are actual beings. So we have this depiction of Yahweh going to war, and when he defeats his enemies, and the event of fighting the chariot wheels and he's the cloud rider there locally, and then closing the sea on them. This is described as a battlefield. We often imagine this event in the Exodus as, from the perspective of the refugees who are trying to escape, and then we just talk about Yahweh's actions as simply miracles, kind of divorced and aloof from what's happening. But in Exodus 14:24, I think, it literally says Yahweh looked down from the cloud on them and began to disturb their chariot wheels, and the Egyptians said their God is fighting for them. So they understood this as a battle. And we have this picture here in Deuteronomy 32. Yahweh will do a similar thing. He's going to come and make war on enemy people and the Elohim they're allied with. So, and he's going to be successful in it, is essentially what this says. I could go on reading in Exodus 15, 1 through 18, but I don't think that that would be especially effective for this video. So I can at least say I can pick up in chapter 15 and say, let's see here. Oh. So we can say, "You stretched out your right," verse 11. I'll pick up in 11. "You blew with your breath," this is Exodus 15, verse 11, I'm sorry. "Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you? Glorious in holiness, awesome in praiseworthy actions, doing wonders. You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loyal love, you led the people whom you redeemed. In your strength, you guided them to the abode of your holiness." We're talking about Mount Horeb. This is all local language. This is Yahweh in the cloud. This is a song that Moses sings, and it's directed at Yahweh in the cloud rider, the one who literally just performed these events in front of them. They immediately respond in spontaneous worship, is the idea. And then we have this idea of peoples hearing. Peoples heard, they trembled, anguish seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were horrified, great distress seized the leaders of Moab. All of the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell on them. At the greatness of your arm they became silent like the stone, until your people passed by, Yahweh, until the people whom you bought passed by. You brought them and planted them on the mountain of your inheritance. So this idea of a mountain being the intended aim in a battle, having to lead to it, that connects a lot of these texts. You bought them and planted them on the mountain of your inheritance, a place you made for yourself to inhabit. Yahweh, a sanctuary, Lord, that your hands established. Yahweh will reign as king forever. So they understand this as, they see Yahweh kinging, Yahweh functioning as a king is synonymous with Yahweh functioning as a localized warrior. I'll say that again. Their depiction of Yahweh as a king is synonymous with their understanding that Yahweh is functioning as a localized warrior. And this war that they depict includes unseen entities, Elohim, gods, and seen entities, humans, kings, warriors, and they're seen as a kind of symbiotic coalition. It's not one or the other, it is both. And Yahweh goes to war against both. And this should be easy for us to understand, because one of the things we screen out is, isn't that what Israel is? The coalition of an unseen God and a seen people. It just so happens that Yahweh is the only Elohim that's allowed to receive worship. He's the only Elohim that's allowed to be honored. He is the creator of all other Elohim. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth. But we get that idea that when Yahweh fights for Israel, Israel is still picking up their sword and fighting. Both is happening at the same time. And so that would be their depiction of the enemy peoples. And I just showed you a very ancient example of that, Exodus 15. I will read Isaiah, very quick verse here, Isaiah 49, verse 2. We're going to talk about this idea of my sword right here. So it's Chorbi Tochal Basar Midam Chalal Chorbi, my sword. This idea of Yahweh being a sword bearer. It's typically associated with Yahweh himself. And a passage that I did not write down, but I think is worth looking at is Joshua 5:13-15. It correlates with what I'm talking about, so I'm going to write that over here. Joshua 5:13-15. And it happened when Joshua was by Jericho. He looked up and he saw a man standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. That's a very specific description, the sword drawn in his hand, typically associated with Yahweh locally in the Old Testament. So Joshua goes up to this man, this human figure who has a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you with us, or are you with our adversaries?" He said, "Neither. I have come now as the commander of Yahweh's army." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and he bowed down and said to him, "What is my Lord commanding his servant? Who is this figure? Is it just a lesser angel?" Joshua understands that this person is a celestial being. He's in a human form, but he doesn't treat him like a human. And the text is actually going to give us in the very next verse who we should identify this captain of Yahweh's armies as. The commander of Yahweh's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now this is a direct correlation to what happened to Moses. Joshua is about to receive marching orders. And it seems like the end of 5 is a continuation of a discussion that starts in Joshua 6. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because the presence of Israelites, no one was coming out or going in. And Yahweh said to Joshua, "Look, I'm going to give Jericho near him." So we're not given in chapter 6 the context of Yahweh giving Joshua the marching orders. But if we remember, chapters and verses are just made up. Okay, chapters and verses are a later addition from the 1500s AD. It actually is just a continuation of this scene where Joshua's in the presence of the local Yahweh and he has a sword in his hand, drawn. And he's at the head of the army. This is like a king. Now, there's a temptation in us to want to say, okay, well, or at least there's a temptation in a lot of other people and traditions to say, well, it's just a lesser being, because he uses the language commander or something like this. But you have to remember, in this ancient depiction, kings will often go out to war with their people. Often kings will be at the head of the battle. David is known for this, and actually, after he's super successful, but after a while, they actually changed this setup because they value him too much. But for the most of David's kingship, he goes out to battle ahead of his people. And so kings were the ones who actually went on the battlefield. So this is the local Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, the name of Yahweh, different depictions for him in the Old Testament. But there he is with Joshua. He's depicted as having a sword drawn in his hand. And he is going to do battle. He's going to battle Elohim and he's going to battle humans. So that's a good kind of segue. Isaiah 63, let's talk about a little bit about this idea of Isaiah 63, Yahweh. who is this coming from Edom, from Bozrah in bright red garments? Who is this honored in his garment, lying down in great strength? It is I, speaking in justice, mighty to save. This is Yahweh. Why are your garments red? And your garments like he who treads in the winepress. I trod in the winepress alone, and there was no man from the peoples with me. This is Yahweh. And I trod them in my anger, and I trampled them in my wrath, and I spattered their juice on my garments and stained all my clothing. For the day of vengeance was in my heart. And you're going to see that the idea of Yikom, he will take vengeance from the calm. Vengeance will be brought to his enemies. The day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of blood vengeance has come. This connection of blood vengeance. Remember, he'll be drunk from the blood. It says twice, from blood and from the flesh, from the blood of the pierced or the slain. And then right here, it will say, we're jumping into verse 43 just because it's helpful here. In verse 43, it's going to say, because the blood of his sons, he will avenge. He will avenge. He will take vengeance or revenge. Okay, Yahweh will do that. So we have in this passage, these two verses, this idea of blood being used 3 times. Vengeance is repeated over and over again. And it connects to this future picture of Isaiah 63. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of my blood vengeance has come. And I looked, but there was no helper, and I was appalled, but there was no one who sustained. So my arm came to assist me, and my wrath was what sustained me. And I trampled peoples in my anger, and I made them drunk in my wrath, and I brought their juice down to the earth. This idea of drunkenness and wrath and blood vengeance, these ideas are connected. And you can see that here, the idea of being drunk from blood, wrath being actualized in the form of vengeance and requital and repayment. And all of this preceding atonement, possibly even being coterminous with the term atonement. Yeah. And then we have later on this, again, a depiction of the local Yahweh is the response to this. This is Isaiah's response in verse 7. I will mention the loyal love of Yahweh, the praises of Yahweh, according to all that Yahweh has done for us, and the greatness of goodness to the house of Israel that he has done to them according to his mercy and the abundance of his loyal love. And he said, surely my people are children. They will not break faith. And he became a savior to them. By the way, this is Isaiah 63:8. Isaiah is about to go back into the Exodus narrative. He's about to revisit the Exodus narrative. And it talks of the way it opens that story is it says Yahweh became a savior to them. What does that mean? Well, that's actually a simple way to say he localized. He showed up. He actually showed up in the bush, and he showed up in Egypt, and he was in the cloud, and he fought back their enemies, and he himself was present and rescued them. He himself dwelt in a house that they built for him. That's what it means to become a savior for them. It's not just abstractly that I decided to do events that would save them, but that he showed up. And we know this because of what's coming. In all their distress, there was no distress. And the messenger or angel or malach and the messenger of his presence saved them. This local manifestation of Yahweh. It's the messenger of his presence, Yahweh's presence. In his love and compassion, he himself redeemed them. He himself, notice that language, he himself. He didn't send an underling. He himself redeemed them, and he lifted them up, and he supported them all the days of old. See, that's one of the ways that ancient Israelites would consider the messenger of Yahweh's presence is Yahweh's needs to say, I myself will do this. Part of the reason for this is Yahweh is a king, but he's enthroned in the Shemayim, in the heavens. He does not leave that throne. An empty throne is a power vacuum. So how does Yahweh stay enthroned in the heavens and show up locally to help? The way that they solve this conundrum, it's a philosophical conundrum, it's a spiritual conundrum, is Yahweh manifests himself as he sends the messenger of his very presence, or the local Yahweh, as the visible Yahweh, is how Michael Heiser makes that distinction, the invisible Yahweh, the visible Yahweh. But they were the ones, so we're getting to verse 10, but they, Exodus Israel, just after post-Exodus Israel, but they were the ones who rebelled, and they grieved his Holy Spirit. So he became an enemy to them, and he himself fought against them. Then his people remembered the days of old, of Moses. Where is the one who led them up from the sea with the shepherds of his flock? Where is the one who puts his Holy Spirit inside him? Okay, who put his spirit of holiness inside him and made his magnificent arm move at the right hand of Moses, who divided the waters before them to make an everlasting name for himself, who led them through the depths. They did not stumble like a horse in the desert, like cattle in the valley that goes down. The Spirit of Yahweh gave them rest. And so you lead your people to make a magnificent name for yourself. We have this idea of Yahweh localizing and inheriting or making a powerful name for himself. That directly connects to the prologue in Hebrews 1. This idea that him showing up locally and doing these actions by going to war, Yahweh localizing as a king and warrior to beat back the coalition of humans and Elohim to make a great name for himself. Okay? And in the very act of doing that, guess what happens at the same time? Around the same time, you remember the Passover event? Atonement is accomplished. Cleansing is accomplished. Even as he comes down to make war, he cleanses his people, but makes war on their enemies and their gods, or on their enemies and the gods of their enemies. So we know that this is connected to his localization, because watch the concern that Isaiah has when he continues. Who led them to the depths, they did not stumble like a horse in the desert, like cattle in the valley that goes down. The Spirit of Yahweh gave him rest, so you lead your people to make a magnificent name for yourself. Where is Yahweh's location at this point? Well, the idea would be, it depends on how you understand how Isaiah was composed or how it's written. Either people who were following Isaiah added to this, or Isaiah himself is prognosticating telling the future. But he says, Yahweh is in heaven. Look from heaven and see from the lofty residence of your holiness and glory. Where are your zeal and strength? Your compassion and mercy to me hold themselves back. For you are our Father. Although Abraham does not know us and Israel does not acknowledge us, you, Yahweh, are our Father, our Redeemer. From of old is your name. Why do you make us wander, Yahweh? You harden our heart from your ways so that we do not fear you. Turn back for the sake of your servants, the tribes of your inheritance. Your holy people took possession for a little while. Our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary. There's the idea. See, Yahweh's already left the sanctuary at this point of this vision in Isaiah. He leaves it in Ezekiel 9-11, but in this vision, Yahweh has already left, and the enemies, the adversaries, have trampled down his sanctuary. We have been since antiquity. You did not rule them. They were not called by your name. Okay, there is this idea that the enemies have already come in that are not called by his name, and they've trampled the space. Notice how, when we look at the opposite, that war against Israel is war against Yahweh. It's war against sacred space. It's war against his sanctuary. That's what these texts are calling to mind. So you can't divorce these texts from this narrative. So we just worked through Isaiah 63. And there are so many other texts we could talk about with Yahweh bearing his sword and going to war with enemy people and their gods, their coalition of gods. I think I'm just going to touch on Isaiah 49 verse 2, so we can start to transition to talking about this strange Yeshua figure. So in Isaiah 49:2, I'll actually start in verse 1. Listen to me, coastlands, and listen attentively, peoples from far away. Yahweh called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he made my name known. So we're now talking about Yeshua. It's a prophecy. It's in Isaiah 49. Verse 2, he made my mouth like a sharp sword. He hid me in the shadow of his hand, and he made me like a sharpened arrow. He hid me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will show my glory. But I myself had said, I've used up my strength for nothing in vanity. Nevertheless, my justice is with Yahweh, and my reward is with my God. Okay? This is talking about Yeshua, the idea that he's expended his life. He's talking about being betrayed and handed over, and his ministry and his life and his reception ending in futility and in vanity on the cross. Verse 5, and now Yahweh says, who formed me from the womb as a servant for him, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might not be gathered. I am honored in the eyes of Yahweh, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is trivial for you to be a servant for me, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, to be my salvation to the ends of the earth. He's speaking to the Messiah. Thus says Yahweh, the Redeemer of Israel, his Holy One, to the one who despises life, to the one who abhors the nation, to the slave of rulers. Kings shall see and stand up, princes, and they shall bow down for the sake of Yahweh, who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, and he has chosen you. This idea of kingships, rulerships, kings and rulers, these are not just seen kings. These are unseen kings as well. Unseen rulers. Satan makes a claim about himself in Luke that he has all the kingdoms. They're all his. Paul will say that we don't battle against flesh and blood, but against authorities and rulers and archons in the heavenly places. Kingships and rulers. This is why Yeshua's power spreading in the church is a kingdom, the kingdom of God advancing against other kingdoms. We wouldn't talk about a kingdom advancing against nothing. There are unseen kingdoms. And this human figure who he says he made his mouth like a sharp sword. There's this figure who has his mouth like a sharp sword. This is very similar to Revelation, where it says that Yeshua has a sword that proceeds from his mouth, that he does war, he goes to battle with. These ideas tie into ancient ideas connected to priests and kings. As an aside, I'm just going to give you a couple of nuggets here before we transition to some key texts. I'm going to take you to Psalm 110, which is a king-priest text. I'm going to take you to Psalm 22, 19 to 31, and we're going to touch on Colossians 2, 6 to 15, and then I'm going to read Wisdom of Solomon 18, 20 to 25. But before I do that, I just want to read a side note here. Functioning as a priest is an act of war. Okay, the priests bring praise, prayers, and sacred vessels to the battlefield. They usher the local Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, onto the battlefield to do war. Okay? Golgotha, and I've already said this, Golgotha is a battlefield. Yeshua is the priest and local Yahweh. Melchitzedek is the king priest, a warrior priest. So kind of with this background, let's transition here. Let's talk about Psalm 110. Remember, I keep bringing up Hebrews. I probably should just go ahead and read Hebrews 1, the prologue anyways, just those first few verses, so we can get a picture of how these texts came together for the early church. Although God spoke long ago in many parts and in many ways to the fathers by the prophets, in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world, who is the radiance of his glory and the representation of his essence, sustaining all things by the word of power. As a side note, this radiance of his glory, representation of his essence, the Greek for this is pulled out of the work, the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, the Wisdom of Solomon has many chapters and many portions, but it's alluded to and referenced a lot by the author of Hebrews. And the audience that he was writing to would have been familiar with this book, with this work, the Wisdom of Solomon. And he uses it authoritatively here. So he said that he's describing Yeshua prior to his incarnation. And then he bridges to what he did, what Yeshua did when he first came, when he first descended, when he had made purification for sins through him, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become by so much better than the angels, by as much as he has inherited a more excellent name than theirs. And this is describing Yeshua, what he has done. I'm going to make an argument here that's well supported, but it might be strange, so I want you to try to track with me. Here's the argument. The way that Yeshua inherits a name that's more excellent than the angels is the same way that the local Yahweh in Isaiah 63 makes a great name for himself compared to other gods and compared to other spiritual beings. He makes a name for himself that's great through localizing, redeeming a people, atoning for them, even while he does war against enemy coalitions and their gods. So Yeshua receives this name because of an act of war. We tend to misread what happened on the cross. It is an act of war. It's understood that way in Hebrews, largely throughout. It's also understood as a priestly function, a priestly act, right? A sacrifice. But it is also an act of war. So I'm going to jump. I'll continue in verse 5 in Hebrews 1. For to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you, and again I will be his father, and he will be my son. Okay, this is in Psalm 2. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and all the angels of God worship him. This is an allusion in the Greek to our verse. Deuteronomy 32, 42 to 43, specifically 43. It says, rejoice with him, O heavens, v'hishtachavuu lo kol Elohim. Worship him, all gods. Worship him, all you gods. Hishtachavuu lo, worship him, kol Elohim, all gods. So this is our verse. It's in Hebrews. When do they do that in this verse? Well, they do it when Yahweh's coming down to make war. So the author of Hebrews is interesting because he seems to have access to texts that line up with the Septuagint, but also line up with other Hebrew texts. So he's well aware of these ideas. These ideas are going to be central to the case that he's building. This prologue is about to be expanded, and its first attempt to be expanded early on in his epistle, he references this verse, this idea of Yahweh coming as a local man of war and defeating the captives from their long hairy heads, and the heavens rejoicing with him, and commanding these defeated figures to bow down and worship him. That is actually, the question may be, why now? Why would they suddenly bow down and worship? What changed? They were in rebellion against Yahweh for a very long time. What changed? The event or impetus of them bowing down and worshiping them in Deuteronomy is Yahweh coming and making war on them and defeating them. Then when they're defeated, their response is they have to bow down. Now, we often understand that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Yeshua is Messiah or Lord. Yeshua is the Lord to the glory of God the Father. We tend to think of human knees bowing. Elohim will also bow. It's the idea that these divinities, these divine beings, these Elohim, will also be forced in their defeat to worship Yeshua. This is partly how he unites heaven and earth. Humans will not be the only creatures bowing down. And that's what this verse is talking about in Deuteronomy. That's what's being talked about in Hebrews 1. This is actually how the author of Hebrews lays out. Look, Yeshua isn't just some underling or some angel. This is like I told you before with Isaiah 63. It's the idea that you yourself became a savior to them. You sent them the messenger of your very presence to them, the local Yahweh. Yeshua is the local Yahweh. He's the image of God. He's not just some lesser Elohim or lesser angel. And this background builds that case. If you have this verse in view, it's very easy to make that case. That's why the author of Hebrews employs it. So I worked you through Hebrews here. I want to read Psalm 110. So, Psalm 110. Okay. 7 verses. You're going to see something interesting here. There is a connection. There's a connection between priesthood and kings, or rather there's a connection between being a priest and making war. The same way there's a connection between being a king and making war. I've already made that connection that the commander of Yahweh's armies is the local Yahweh. He goes and fights at the head of them, similar to David fighting in front of his people. The idea is that Yahweh would fight locally. That's not a new idea. I'm actually going to reference some other passages to demonstrate that in the Torah. But before I do, I'm going to read Psalm 110. Very famous psalm, very central to Hebrews 1, central to Yeshua's ministry and his self-understanding of his vocation and how he presented himself in a tricky way to his living audience in his earthly ministry. He actually brings this psalm up to trick the Pharisees. And he says, a declaration of Yahweh to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The problem for them is going to be, by the time they get to the text, they don't say Yahweh's name anymore in Yeshua's day. So it's in Greek either Kyrios and Kyrios, or it's Mar and Mar in Aramaic, or it's Adon and Adonai in Hebrew. So it gets read, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Yeshua ends up asking the Pharisees, who is the Messiah? They say, oh, it's David's son. Well, why does David call him Lord if he's his son? And they don't know how to answer him. And he uses it to silence them, essentially. But the point is this, the text is interesting because there are two lords. David is the author. David calls this human figure his Lord. Yahweh will send out your mighty scepter from Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer in the day of your power, or the day of your battle. See, this translation, I don't know why they translate that as the day of your power. Amacha nerevot beyom chelecha, in the day of your battle, in the day of your confrontation. So this is already, there's a battle. This figure in Psalm 110 is a warrior, and he's going to go to war. Think of how many times Hebrews alludes to Psalm 110. It's integral to the text. It is depicting Yeshua as a priest, yes, and that's obvious on the surface to us as Westerners. But because he keeps using these texts, it is depicting him as a warrior priest, a priest at war. In holy splendor from the womb of the dawn, you will have the dew of your youth. Okay, that is a very obscure verse. It seems poetical and tricky. It would be a great passage to silence people with, because people don't want to pretend that they know what that means, because it's not very apparent. Me'rechem mishchar, from the womb of the dawn, lechatal, yaldutecha, they will have the dew of your youth. It is a very obscure passage, but this part is not obscure. Verse 4, Yahweh has sworn, he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the manner of Melchitzedek. Yeah, you are a priest forever, according to Melchitzedek. That's repeated over and over again to describe Yeshua. Nishba Yahweh velo yinchem, ata kohen le'olam, al divrati Melchitzedek. You are a priest forever in the order according to Melchitzedek. O Lord, at your right hand, he will shatter kings in the day of his anger. Now this is a tricky verse. O Lord, at your right hand, he will shatter kings in the day of his anger. Where is this? I don't know if you can see this right here. Sure. Okay, so we have David praying this. Okay. Who is he describing? O Lord, at your right hand, he will shatter kings in the day of his anger. In Hebrew, it's a little bit easier to see in Hebrew. Adonai, al yamincha, Lord, on your right hand. Machatz, okay? He will, machatz is break or shatter. The day apo, machin, he will break and shatter kings. He'll break and shatter kings. If David is saying, Yahweh is at your right hand, that's I guess that could be okay. That's not a problematic translation. But if David is saying the Lord is this human figure at Yahweh's right hand, that's where problems begin to ensue. And that is in fact the heart of the gospel. It's the claim that the local Yahweh ends up sitting down at the right hand of Yahweh. He sits down at the right hand of the Father after having defeated enemies. When would he have defeated enemies? He will judge the nations, and this is future tense, this human figure, this Lord, he will judge among the nations, he will fill them with corpses, he will shatter the rulers of many countries. This is very similar to this warrior language. He will drink from the stream by the road, therefore he will lift up his head. Another enigmatic verse. So Psalm 110 depicts this warrior priest. David calls this human figure Lord or Master, and he's at the right hand of Yahweh. Here's a helpful depiction. When I said he became a savior to them in Isaiah 63 and he showed up, it says his very right hand was next to Moses. In the context, it's actually a synonym for the local warrior Yahweh, or the spirit of Yahweh was his right hand. It is almost like imagining that this figure is Yahweh's right hand. The right hand of Yahweh is this human figure, which is why he's installed at the right hand. And it is often said that when Yahweh makes war, he does so with his right hand. You can imagine that that's another way to get around the idea that how does Yahweh remain enthroned in the heavens and do stuff on the earth? That's a theological question. They have different ways of answering. One way to answer it is he did it with his right hand. So there he is, he's enthroned above the heavens, there's the barrier, and he reaches down with his right hand, I'm still in the heavens, and my right hand is still Yahweh. He's doing things and battling people and fighting and doing all that kind of stuff. Okay, the right hand of Yahweh. That's also how they would have depicted Yahweh at war. So we worked through Psalm 110 to a degree, a warrior priest. I'm going to, at this point, go to Colossians 2, because this is, in the New Testament, we see Yeshua's crucifixion as an act of war, and he defeats the enemies. Okay, Colossians 2, starting in verse 6. Therefore, as you've received Messiah Yeshua the Lord, live in him, firmly rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding with thankfulness. So Paul's going to reference how they were taught. How were they taught about the lordship of Yeshua? How were they taught about the gospel? Beware, lest anyone take you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Messiah. Now, here's this human collision thing again to a degree. These philosophers, they have tradition according to the elemental spirits of the world. These elemental spirits, in Greek, we have the stoicheia, or the stichia, if it's modern pronunciation, the stoicheia. They are sometimes depicted that word is sometimes used for beginning elements or foundation. Sometimes it's used for figures or constellations or Elohim or beings or principles, but they're primeval and they're often spoken of as Elohim. So here it would make sense that Paul is talking about kind of not just principles, but actual beings, primeval beings that actually are the reason that these philosophers are deceived. And he also, Paul's very smart here, so he's also attacking the way that these philosophers tended to be Greek ascetics, and they were against, bodily incarnation. They all these weird stories about emanation. So he says, beware lest anyone take you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, not according to Messiah. Because in him, in Messiah, all the fullness of deity dwells bodily. The local Yahweh. All the fullness of deity dwells bodily. And he's going to actually set up the Messiah, all the fullness of Yahweh locally, against these elemental spirits. And you, the church in Colossae, you are filled in him, who is the head over every ruler and authority. Or does he just mean human authorities? No, he means unseen authorities too. In whom, in Messiah, also you were circumcised with a circumcision not made by hands, by the removal of the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Messiah, having been buried with him in baptism, in which also you were raised together with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. Remember, Michael Heiser will make an interesting point about this in some of his books, but you can see this in 1 Corinthians 10, that baptism in the early church, and in Pauline terms, Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians 10, baptism is part of this war. Baptism is associated with Yahweh localizing in war. They were baptized into the Red Sea. At the time Yahweh was destroying Egypt and their gods, he was baptizing his people. They were baptized into the sea, Paul says. It's in 1 Corinthians. And so you have this idea that baptism is still a part of the local Yahweh making war. And this line continues. So he goes on from baptism to say, in the baptism, with him in baptism, in which also you were raised together with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And although you were dead in the trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all trespasses, having destroyed the certificate of indebtedness and ordinances against us, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. I would actually read this because Colossians and Ephesians have a lot in common. I would read this passage in light of Ephesians, where it talks about the two being made into one, and there being a dividing wall and a source of enmity and a means of keeping the Jewish people in bondage to sin and keeping the Gentiles in bondage to sin without hope and without God. And so this certificate of indebtedness would be this idea of the Torah dividing them. And so, having destroyed the certificate of indebtedness and ordinances against us, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. So Yeshua defeats this setup in himself. He is the Torah incarnate. And this act is not an act of, it's not simply a priestly act. It's not, he doesn't simply officiate. It is an act of war. So the verse that follows it is, okay, removed it out, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers and the authorities, he made a display of them in public, triumphing over them by it. So it's an act of triumph, an act of war. This fits very nicely with this depiction of Yeshua as the high priest in the order of Melchitzedek in Hebrews, how Yeshua talked about himself in a tricky way to the Pharisees, how this verse, Deuteronomy 32, 42 to 43, would have been picked up by the author of Hebrews and understood, and there are still yet more connections to come in the text. I'm going to go to Psalm 22, 19 to 31. Okay, go to Psalm 22, 19, and I'll read through 31. Psalm 22, guys, go check it out. It is a prophetic psalm about Yeshua being betrayed, crucified, killed, and raised. And it is incredible. All the details are there. And being crucified, him being, his hands and feet being pierced, him having a dry mouth, them casting lots for his clothing, him being surrounded by bulls of Bashan, which we're going to get into Psalm 68. I'm not going to read all that to you, but I will touch on this piece at the beginning. Take note, I've said this earlier in the video, there's no such thing as chapters and verses. These are innovations that are introduced into the text to help us around in the 1500s AD. And they're helpful, but they can actually obscure certain contextual points, and they definitely remove the historical aspects of how, or they remove from our understanding how the ancients would have approached the text. And here's what I mean. You don't have chapters and verses. That means you don't have numbers for Psalms. You don't have Psalm 1, you have a Psalm. You don't have Psalm 23, you just have a Psalm. So how do I tell people, go and read this Psalm? How would I tell people, go and read this Psalm? How would I let people know? For example, how would I say, go read Psalm 23? Well, you would tell them the first line. So when you want to discuss an entire Psalm, you just say the first line of the Psalm. So I wouldn't say, go read Psalm 23. I would say, go read the Lord is my shepherd. Okay, you know to go read that. What is it? So Ashrei Asher Lo, what is it? Ashrei Asher Lo Halach B'atzat Rashaim. Blessed is the man who does not, like I've just quoted Psalm 1. I would say, there's the first line. If I wanted you to read Psalm 22, what would I say to you? I would say, oh, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is exactly what Yeshua does on the cross. He tells them, go read Psalm 22. And he does it at a very particular point. He does it after all these things are fulfilled. He lets them know it's too late. Yeshua, even on the cross, is brazen. He is brazen. He is committed to this vocation to the very end with zeal. He is literally, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is partially goading the people that are around him. His life is a parable up to the very end. Only those who have the eyes to see will see it, and those who have the ears to hear will hear it and understand what he means. And they know he's being tricky because they think he's calling to Elijah. So that's a funny thing. We'll read that like it's like, oh, he's sad. But they didn't say he's sad. They thought he was calling for Elijah. They wanted to see what would happen. So he bursts out and says this. He's actually telling them to read Psalm 22, and there it is. It would all be fulfilled. It would have terrified the Pharisees for sure. It would have terrified whatever coalition was against him among the Pharisees and those. But I'm going to read Psalm 22, 19 through 31, just so you can see the picture of Yeshua, facing that vanity, the futility, this death, and the human sense, but also at the same time making war. He says, but you, O Yahweh, do not remain distant. O my help, hasten to me. Rescue my life from the sword, my only life from the power of the dogs. Dogs is a word for Gentiles, and they're around, are unclean creatures, and they are around. He is surrounded by Gentiles. Save me from the mouth of the lion, from the horns of the wild oxen, answer me. This is partly depicting human elements that are destructive and ravenous like a lion, but it also is pointing to Satan. It's pointing to the lion who seeks whom he may devour. And the horns of the wild oxen is also pointing to other Elohim that are in collision with Satan. That would have been understood through Psalm 68, which I'm going to read. And they are directly They actually are directly referenced earlier in the psalm. He'll say in verse 12, I will actually read verse 12 of Psalm 22, many bulls have encircled me, mighty bulls of Bashan have surrounded me. We'll get to what that means. So rescue my life from the sword, my only life from the power of the dogs. Save me from the mouth of the lion, from the horns of the wild ox, and answer me. I will tell your name to my brothers. Inside the assembly I will praise you. You who fear Yahweh, praise him. Glorify him, all you seed of Jacob, and be in awe of him, all you seed of Israel. Because he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and has not hid his face from him. But he listened to him when he cried for help. So here's Yeshua crying out for help. The very act of crying out for help, he uses a psalm to do it. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? It tells the end, and it kind of is, it's brazen because it chastises the people who are even making fun of him while he's on the cross, because Psalm 22 prophesies that they will do that. But the end of this psalm is not good for them. He will be enthroned at the end of this psalm. Yeshua will be enthroned. And he makes the point that his act of prayer, praying a psalm, by the way, who would pray a psalm as an act of war? Priests. So Yehoshaphat would send priests at the front of the army, and they would sing the psalm. They would sing a psalm to Yahweh, or hymns, typically a refrain. What is it? Give Hodel Yahweh ki tov ki le'olam chasdo. Give thanks to Yahweh for his good. His loyal love endures forever. And they would go into battle singing the psalm. Again, remember I said functioning as a priest is an act of war. They bring praise, prayers, and sacred vessels to the battlefield. And this metaphor, you could say, Yeshua is bringing this prayer, this praise, he's bringing this song. The sacred vessel that he brings is himself. He himself is referred to as the temple. He's referred to as the Ark of the Covenant, where the very presence of Yahweh is to be found. He is the tent. And often they would bring sacred vessels onto the battlefield. Those were visible expressions of the fact that the invisible or an unseen local Yahweh is fighting. Because the local Yahweh can be unseen or he can make himself seen, but he is present. His presence is felt. And so Yeshua this is a depiction of Yeshua as making war. Golgotha as battlefield. And he is saying that the cry that he prayed was not ignored by heaven. You have this weird thing where people say, oh, God turned his face away from Jesus. Psalm 22 is quoted in all the Gospels for the crucifixion scene, and it literally says in verse 24, because he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hid his face from him, but he listened to him when he cried for help. I don't know how more specific Yahweh could have been to try to stop people from believing that he hid his face from his son. I don't think that he could have. So the desire to go on believing that Yahweh hid his face from Jesus is just like a refusal to read the Gospels according to how the authors intended to read them. They filled the passion narrative with Psalm 22. Psalm 22 literally says he didn't hide his face from them. Okay. Moving on. From you is my praise. In the great assembly, I will pay my vows before those who revere him. For those who fear him. The afflicted will eat and will be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise Yahweh. May your heart live forever. Do you see how war language, or do you see how king language and this kind of battlefield context can be dovetailed with redemption and salvation? Notice that when Yahweh makes war in the Exodus, there are the aged and the old and the toddlers trying to escape through the Red Sea. Redemption is happening while battle is taking place. And so Yeshua's act is a sacrifice. This act simultaneously is accomplishing these things. He is, through this act, he is ensuring that the afflicted will eat and will be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise Yahweh. May your heart live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. Again, all these things would be depicted with the word the Lord, Kyrios in Greek, Mar in Aramaic, Adonai in Hebrew, and Yeshua is the Lord. They lost saying the name of Yahweh in the exile. This is the act of the local Yahweh's name being restored to the people of God. The name of the local Yahweh was given to the people of God, to Abraham as El Shaddai. The name of the local Yahweh, or it was given to Moses as Yahweh, and this would be the idea that the name of the local Yahweh is given to those in the new covenant through this act, through this Exodus, as Yeshua, Jesus, the name above all names. So all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will worship before you, because the kingship belongs to the Lord, or to Yahweh, or to Yeshua, and he rules over the nations. All the healthy ones of the earth will eat and worship. The way he rules over the nations is by defeating all the gods of the nations. By defeating them. And he defeats them in an act of war, and their only option left is to bow down and worship. They are defeated. All the healthy ones of the earth will eat and worship. Before him, all those descending in the dust will kneel, even he who cannot keep his soul alive. Everyone's going to kneel. Descendants will serve him. Regarding the Lord, it will be told to the next generation. They will come and tell his saving deeds to a people yet to be born, that he has done it. Okay, so we've worked through quite a few passages. I'm going to read the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18, verses 20 to 25. Again, the Wisdom of Solomon is quoted by the book of Hebrews extensively. It's directly quoted verbatim in the prologue. Let's see. I am going to read chapter 18, verses 20 to 25. And this is to let you know, this is how they understood priests. The author of the Wisdom of Solomon understood functioning as a priest as an act of war. This is helpful to remember. If you look in Isaiah 52 or Isaiah 53, the Targums, the Aramaic translations of Isaiah 52 and 53, the Messiah, the name Messiah is literally put in place. So in the Hebrew, it doesn't say the title Messiah, but it gets injected into the Targum. And it calls him a priest. It understands that the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 is explicitly said to be functioning as a priest. The Messiah is a priest figure, which again dovetails back into Psalm 110. But this is where we get, they understood that Melchitzedek, this warrior priest, did both. And sometimes they would see the act itself of functioning as a priest as an act of war. And I'll read you this example. The author of the Wisdom of Solomon is going to recall the events in Numbers 16, where after the rebellion of Korah, Datan and Abiram, this crew that wants to kick Moses and Aaron out, a plague comes on the people and death starts to attack the people in the wilderness, and Aaron has to intercede for them and make atonement for them with incense. But this is a familiar tale, a familiar narrative in Numbers 16, and it directly precedes Aaron's staff budding and being put in his position of prominence that's unquestioned. But this is how the author of the Wisdom of Solomon recalls that event. But the experience of death touched also the righteous. Then destruction came on the multitude in the desert, but the wrath did not remain long, for a blameless man hurried and fought as their champion, bringing the weapon of his own ministry, prayer and incense for atonement. This is war language. For a blameless man hurried, this is Aaron, for a blameless man hurried and fought as their champion, bringing the weapon of his own ministry, prayer and incense for atonement. Atonement is about warfare. The priest makes war through offering prayers and incense. The priest, whilst making war, is using incense to make atonement, a clean substance to make atonement. He resisted the anger and put an end to the calamity, showing that he was your servant. This is about Aaron. Aaron resisted the anger, and this high priest resisted the anger and put an end to the calamity, showing that he was your servant. He was victorious over the crowd, not by strength of body or by the working of weapons, but he subdued the punisher by word, reminding him of the oaths and covenants of the ancestors. For when the dead had already fallen on one another in heaps, standing between them, he drove back the wrath and cut off the way to the living. So again, atonement turns away wrath in this depiction. For the entire world was on his full-length garment. This is the fact that the priestly garments that he was wearing, it is a cosmological reference, as the idea that all the worlds are represented in this garment, and he stands in for them, the creator of the worlds. He stands in this role of interceding for all the worlds, all the realms, all creation. For the entire world was on his full-length garment, and the glories of the ancestors on a 4-row engraving of stone on his chest, and your greatness on the diadem of his head, a crown. He is functioning. It's showing his garb as it's relaying his garb as a priest, but it's showing the cosmological significance significance as a priest, very similar to Hebrews. The destroyer yielded to these, and they were frightened of these things, for just the intent of anger was sufficient. Okay, so that will show you how the author of Hebrews is kind of thinking through the priesthood, Yeshua's high priesthood, and why it connects to the cross, how it connects to the cross. And these ideas are throughout the early church and recorded in multiple places in the New Testament. I've gone through Colossians 2, talked a little bit about Hebrews, the first few passages of Hebrews. I showed you Wisdom of Solomon because it's quoted extensively, and it demonstrates the idea of what Yeshua is doing as a priest, and how it would have been understood in the days of the New Testament. I read Psalm 22, 1931. And the last thing I'm going to talk on is Psalm 68, 14 to 23. So let's jump in. Psalm 68, 14 to 23. Okay. When Shaddai scattered kings on Zalmon it snowed. A mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. So Psalm 68, I don't have time to be able to go into the passages. I will quickly read Numbers. I believe it's Numbers 10. Yeah. I'll start Numbers 10, 33 to 36. And so they set out from the mountain of Yahweh, a journey of 3 days, with the ark of the covenant of Yahweh setting out ahead of them, 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of Yahweh was over them by day when they set out from the camp. And whenever the ark was setting out, Moses would say, "Rise up, Yahweh, may your enemies be scattered, may the ones that hate you flee from your presence." And when the ark rested, he would say, "Return, Yahweh, to the countless thousands of Israel." This is remember what he said when the ark would go out? It would go out for battle and be prepared for battle. Yahweh, may your enemies be scattered. May the ones that hate you flee from your presence. I will read to you the first verse of Psalm 68. God will arise. His enemies will be scattered, and those who hate him will flee before him. It's the same thing. This is the local Yahweh who sits enthroned as king on the ark, who comes in a cloud. Okay, the cloud rider. This also connects to Yeshua, because this is probably finally what he gives him the chance to kill him, and he says, "You'll see me as the cloud rider." Only Yahweh was the cloud rider in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. And they understood this is a claim to be Yahweh. They tear their robes just by him saying he'll ride on the clouds. And Psalm 68 is about this local cloud rider. Yahweh's going to come locally and do battle. And it says, when Shaddai, El Shaddai, scattered kings on Zalmon snowed, talking about an area in the north. Verse 15, a mountain of God. Now it could be God, but it actually ought to be Elohim in the sense of, let's see here. I'm actually going to read it. Har Elohim, Har Bashan. A mountain of gods is the mountain of Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. That's what it's talking about. It's not just a single mountain with a single peak or a single god in this extended metaphor. Bashan, this area in the north, associated with Mount Hermon, associated with dark working from dark Elohim, rulers and principalities. There's too much to go into now. I would say look at Deuteronomy 2, look at Genesis 6. But remember in Psalm 22, bulls of Bashan, these figures, these animal depictions of sources of warfare, Gentile sources of warfare, the varying kings that surround Yeshua. A mountain of gods is the mountain of Bashan, a mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hostility on many peak mountains? This mountain, the mountain God desires for his dwelling. Why are you comparing Bashan as a place in dwelling for gods and Zion, or Sinai rather at this point, and later it's going to be Zion, but Sinai, where he chooses Mount Horeb, where he shows up. Why do you look with hostility? Remember, enmity, hostility? Remember, these elemental spirits, these beings, it's this idea of enmity and hostility coming from these Elohim that came from the divided out nations, the apportion of the nations. Why do you look with hostility on many peak mountains? This mountain God desires for his dwelling. Yes, Yahweh will abide in it forever. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, with thousands doubled. The Lord is among them in Sinai, distinctive in victory. At this point, I would say go back and read Deuteronomy 32, 8 to 9. It says Yahweh apportioned the nations according to the sons of God. That's these guys here, these Elohim. And it's in the same psalm. So in the same psalm, Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, it'll talk about the nations being divided up, actual principalities and rulerships among or according to the sons of God. And these Elohim become rebellious and go to war against Yahweh, these sons of God. They are principalities and rulers. Yahweh is going to make war against them. Yeshua dying on the cross is an act of war against them. Remember, I'm not just going to fight Pharaoh in Egypt. I'm going to fight their gods. I'm not just going to fight Caesar in Rome. I'm going to fight Satan that lies behind that throne. And so that kind of depiction is there. This is where we get to, right here, this idea of captives. Okay? I'm in Deuteronomy 32. I'm going to pick back up at the end of verse 42, this second clause. Because it says Yahweh's arrows will be drunk from blood, and his sword will devour the flesh from the blood of the slain. And captives, Shaliah, captives, and from the heads, hairy, okay, or long locks, from the hairy heads of their enemies. Yahweh, his arrow will be drunk from blood, and his sword will devour the flesh from the blood of the slain, and the captives from the hairy heads of your enemies. Why does that matter? This, again, is a reference to this coalition of gods and men, Elohim and humans, that Yeshua is going to go to war against, that Yahweh, the local Yahweh, goes to war against. You have ascended on high, you have led away captives, you have received gifts from humankind, and even from the rebellious, so that Yahweh, God, may dwell there. In order to prepare the space for Yahweh to live there, he has to beat back and remove the gods and these unclean peoples, this coalition. He has to destroy, he has to remove the coalition. Not just the humans, he has to remove the coalition of the Elohim as well. And this verse, by the way, this is not just some obscure stuff that has nothing to do with anything. This is where Paul gives us church order and church gifts. He gets it from this verse in Ephesians 4. This is where he gets, in Ephesians 4:11, God gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be shepherds, some to be instructors. It's from this stuff, this battle language. And it's directly quoted, he directly quotes Psalm 68. You have ascended on high, you've led away captives, you've received gifts from humankind, so that even from the rebellious, so that Yah may dwell there. Blessed be the Lord. Daily he loads us with benefits, the God of our salvation, Selah. We can continue. Our God is a God of deliverances, and to Yahweh the Lord belongs escapes from death. But God will shatter the head of his enemies, the hairy scalp of the one who continues in his guilt. This is this idea of these ancient Gentile people groups led by this coalition of Elohim going to war against Yahweh, leading to deception in the world, leading to perversion in the world, leading to sin and misery and suffering in the world. Yahweh will show up locally and beat back the seen and unseen elements of sin. God will shatter the head of his enemies, the hairy scalp of the one who continues in his guilt. That's the same idea here. The captives, you have the same language, and the hairy heads of their enemies. Okay, same language. 22, 68, Psalm 68, verse 22. The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, so that your foot may shatter them bloody, for the tongues of your dogs to have their share from the enemies. This is a very dark, scary language. It is a warfare, and it's a time of war. And the psalm is going to transition to a victory psalm when Yeshua marches in to a Zion, or to the new mountain. This stuff is central to Hebrews. I would argue you really can't understand Hebrews if you don't understand this background, because you won't know why it connects or why he pulls out what he does in particular verses. But we have this idea. So now I can translate this last part, heavens. So we have rejoice. I'm going to be in Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. Rejoice. This is translating verse 43 now. Rejoice, heavens, with him. Worship him, all you gods, because the blood of his sons he will avenge, and he will bring vengeance on his enemies or his foes, and he will pay back his haters. And kiper ad mato amo. The Samaritan Pentateuch just says ad mat amo, which is the land. It's a construction of the land of his people. So he will make atonement for the land of his people. This is the last kind of, I guess this is the last kind of portion. I will reference the idea of Numbers 35. With all this background, I can now reference Numbers 35, 30 to 34. This is in the instance of murder that takes place in the land, which blood falls on land, and it defiles the land. Which again, this coalition of enemies is responsible for a lot of bloodshed that defiles the land. Their presence defiles the land, their sin defiles the land, and the blood that they've shed defiles the land. And there needs to be a cleansing and a coverage. If anyone kills, we're in Numbers 35:30. If anyone kills a person, the killer will be put to death according to the testimony of witnesses, or in the Torah. But someone cannot die on the testimony of one person. Also, you will not take a ransom payment. And just, it's interesting here. Sorry. Yeah. Velo tikhu kofer. It's a similar word. You will not take ransom payment. The word for ransom payment is the word for, it's when you take kafar, which is the root of kiper, to make atonement. Kofer is ransom payment, atoning payment, coverage payment. Like when you enter into that, like I said, if you go into a nice, let's say you're going to go to an event, you're like, I don't have money. Your friend's like, don't worry, I'll cover you. It's coverage. So you won't take ransom payment, that coverage. Because in other words, that's how people would be tempted to try to make atonement for murder by saying, I'll pay you ransom payment. Okay, you will not take a ransom payment for the life of the killer who is guilty of death. Indeed, he must surely be put to death. You also will not take a ransom payment for the one that flees to the city of refuge, so that he will return to the land to live in the land before the death of the priest. This is what's interesting. He can't return to live in the land until the priest dies. The death of the priest accomplishes atonement for him. You will not take kofar for the one that flees to the city of his refuge, so that he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. So the guy who accidentally kills somebody might want to return to his land, but he can't return to the land because he shed innocent blood on the land, even accidentally. He's not able to return to the land. And the land itself is crying, the blood cries out. How does he get back to the land? What makes the blood of the slain stop crying out? The death of the high priest. The blood of the high priest. Are we starting to see a connection here? Right? With the blood of the high priest. That's what Hebrews is all about. The blood of the high priest, the land itself is atoned for. And when the land is atoned for, it's almost like a jubilee for that accidental killer. He gets to leave his place of captivity and return to the land of his ancestors and inherit the promise. This is also true for the Day of Atonement. The idea that the Day of Atonement is also the Day of Jubilee. So every 50 years, you count 49 years, and then the 50th year, it's going to be a year of Jubilees. And when do you initiate the year of Jubilees? What day? The Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, in the 50th year, all the slaves go free, atonement is made for the land, and they get to return. This is the kind of picture that's in view. So the land being atoned for is setting it all to right and cleansing it, removing the elements of destruction, and then we can re-enter that promise, and Yahweh is actually dwelling with us locally. It prepares the space. All right, and then 33 to 34, so you will not pollute the land in which you are, because blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is poured out on it, except for the blood of the one who poured it out. You will not defile the land in which you are living, because I am living in the midst of it. I am Yahweh. I am living in the midst of the Israelites. So the whole rationale for this is the local presence of Yahweh. The land can't be defiled lest Yahweh leave. Well, the land does get defiled. The blood has polluted the land. He does leave. And there is this idea that the death of the high priest actually sets in motion events that release people who have defiled the land with blood. And it cleanses the land. And there is, Yeah, so you can't make atonement for the land, for the blood that's poured out, except for the blood of the one who poured it out. And this is, yeah, this includes the guy who killed unintentionally. The guy who killed his neighbor unintentionally, the only way to make atonement for him before the death of the high priest is with his death. But the other way is the high priest dies and he's able to go in. So I've covered a lot of ground. There is this, you have this picture of the local Yahweh coming to make war. The high priest accomplishing atonement, Yahweh doing all of this through Yeshua himself. This is, by the way, you're like, well, gosh, what did Yeshua come to fulfill? According to John 5:30-39, everything. He says, you search the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you possess eternal life, but it's these scriptures that talk about me, yet you won't come to me to find life. So, covered a lot of ground, the land, and by the way, that should help you because I know I'm off them on the atonement train. The land is atoned for. The land is atoned for. So the land is atoned for. And we already have the idea that Yahweh will come locally and requite vengeance. And I think I'll close on this. This is very similar to Yahweh coming with the death of the firstborn and making war on Egypt with angels, with an army, with a multitude, and they actually bring death. And that death is aimed at everyone because he's coming to address why the firstborn, why the males, this kind of thing. They took Israelite males and threw them into the Nile. They murdered Israelite babies. The land cries out. The land of Egypt is crying out. Part of what the death of the firstborn is accomplishing is, it is a vengeance for the death of these Israelite boys. Notice how the vengeance will devour everyone in the land. Yahweh coming locally will devour everyone in the land. Everyone, Israelite and Egyptian alike, unless you make atonement, you apply blood to the threshold of your house, and then he passes over. So that's one of the ways that a lot of pictures here. There are a lot of different passages that dovetail together. I'm at the end of my rope here. We went through a lot of text. I think I covered all the ground. Okay, bless you guys. Let me know whatever questions you have, and if you want me to go in depth again on any kind of subject in Scripture that you think would equip you, I would love to do that. Bless you.